News at 6 o'clock. This is Diana Speed. Good evening. Labour has promised investment on a scale never seen before and says it will fund its plans to overhaul the country's infrastructure through borrowing. The Conservatives accuse Labour of fantasy economics, while also pledging to borrow billions more for public projects. The Liberal Democrats, the Green Party and Plaid Cymru have given details of a pact not to stand against each other in 60 seats to avoid splitting the pro-Remain vote. A police officer has been charged with the murder of the former footballer Dalian Atkinson, who died after being shot with a taser gun 3 years ago. 2 teenage drug dealers have been convicted of the murder of 17-year-old Jodie Chesney, who was stabbed to death while socialising with friends in a London park. Also tonight, why a boxing match between 2 YouTube stars, one British, one American, with a combined following of 40 million people, could be about to break records. Labour and the Conservatives have both put plans for a huge expansion of public spending, funded by extra borrowing, at the heart of their pitch to voters in the general election. Speaking in Liverpool, the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, said he would unleash investment on a scale never seen before, spending an additional £55 billion a year on projects including hospitals, schools and housing, as well as measures to combat climate change. The Chancellor, Sajid Javid, mocked what he called Labour's fantasy economics, but he also announced plans for an infrastructure revolution costing up to £25 billion annually, paid for by much higher levels of borrowing than his recent Conservative predecessors would have contemplated. Our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, reports.
John McDonnell joked today that his spending plans were in the best traditions of British socialism, only no post-war Labour government has ever considered such a massive increase in state spending. A £400 billion programme for roads, rail, council housing, care homes, schools and green energy projects. Money that will be targeted at the north of England and some of the most deprived and run-down parts of the country. The aim, said Mr McDonnell, was to bring about a once-in-a-generation upgrade to the country's infrastructure and productive capacity. A programme, he said, that would transform people's lives.
Our aim as a Labour government is to achieve what past Labour governments have aspired to. An irreversible shift in the balance of power and wealth in favour of working people. And that...
Mr McDonnell also promised decisions over how the money was spent would be taken outside of London. Part of the Treasury would also be relocated to the north of England. Pressed over how the markets might respond, Mr McDonnell said the country was facing a social emergency, and he issued this warning.
The days of the city dictating the terms to the rest of the country are over. They're over. The finance sector will be brought in line with the rest of us in tackling the emergency that we face.
Meanwhile, 30 miles away in Manchester, the Chancellor Sajid Javid, who was setting out the Tories' spending plans, said Labour's approach would result in endless debt and an ever-expanding state. However, in a clear echo of Mr McDonnell's strategy, Mr Javid too promised more borrowing and tens of billions in extra spending.
While we must maintain spending restraint, if we want growth to continue and get stronger in the future, then we need to invest in it, taking the opportunity offered by those historically low borrowing rates. There'll be new hospitals, schools, railways, better broadband. So I can confirm, we will borrow some more to invest.
The fact that Tories want to borrow to spend more can only blunt their attack on Labour. And Labour insiders believe they have now firmly won the economic argument, which is no longer about cuts and austerity, but about spending and then spending some more.
Today's spending announcements represent a radical departure from the idea of needing to balance the books, which previously drove government policy. The Scottish National Party spokesman, Tommy Shepherd, said it was right to reverse that approach.
We have been crucified in Scotland by 10 years of austerity, both in terms of cuts to the block grant that funds the public services the Scottish Government's in charge of, and also by the way in which the working poor in this country, as well as the rest of the UK, have been hammered by cuts to benefit and support. So anything that changes that is very, very welcome.
Our economics editor, Faisal Islam, has this analysis of how the arguments around spending and borrowing appear to have been redrawn.
In the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, day 2 of the election campaign brought a fiscal revolution from both ends of the East Lancashire Road. In Liverpool, Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell, and in Manchester, Chancellor Sajid Javid, both loosening the rules that would have constrained borrowing and debts in order to spend and spend on the future by the bucket load. A new consensus, but the method is different. The Conservatives will drop a key borrowing target, but hope to keep in check the national debt, Britain's total historic borrowings. But if they are shifting the goalposts, then Labour are now playing a different sport, dropping the idea of any type of target on debt and instead using the notion of net worth. This takes into account the value of public sector assets as well as debts. The result is that Labour has created space for hundreds of billions of extra capital investment and has already announced $55 billion a year, doubling current investment plans, to deal with what it calls climate change and social emergencies. The Conservatives will hike investment by tens of billions, up a half on current plans. Labour's plans are more radical. They rely more on the continuation of the current very low borrowing rates offered to governments around the world. And while there is emerging international agreement over taking advantage of these cheap rates to boost growth at a time when central banks are running out of ammunition, there is a limit.
The Bank of England has downgraded the UK's economic growth forecast for the next 3 years, saying it expects the economy will be held back by the global slowdown and Boris Johnson's Brexit deal. It predicts growth will be around 1% lower by 2022 compared with the forecasts it made in August. It's voted to keep interest rates at 0.75%. The Liberal Democrats, Plaid Cymru and the Green Party have formed a pro-Remain alliance for the general election, agreeing not to stand against each other in 60 constituencies in England and Wales. The Lib Dems said the pact was a bold move that would further the cause of Remain. Our political correspondent Susan Hume has more details.
The message on the side of the Lib Dems' yellow election bus is clear.